Welcome to the Entitled Files, where today we meet Linda Maxwell, a self-appointed neighborhood dictator who thought moving into a quiet Michigan suburb meant she could control everyone's property. With her designer sunglasses and perfectly maintained bob, she seemed like just another pushy neighbor, until she decided to wage war against one homeowner's privacy fence. From imported Swiss weed killers to illegal parking tickets, this story of suburban warfare is about to show us what happens when a Karen pushes too far. Let's dive in. Let me tell you about the most insane experience I've ever had with a neighbor. You know those stories about crazy Karens you hear about? Well, I lived through one, and let me tell you, it was even worse than you can imagine. I live in this really nice suburban neighborhood in Michigan. We're talking the kind of place where people actually wave to each other, where kids still ride their bikes on the sidewalks, and where the biggest drama usually involves someone forgetting to bring their trash bins in. Well, that was until Linda moved in. Let me paint you a picture of Linda. Imagine every stereotypical, I need to speak to your manager haircut you've ever seen, but make it expensive. Like, really expensive. She had this perfectly maintained blonde bob that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She wore these massive designer sunglasses that made her look like some kind of fashion-confused bug, and she had this permanent expression like she just smelled something awful. You know the type. The kind of person who thinks they're better than everyone else just because their handbag costs more than your car. The first time I met Linda was actually pretty telling of what was to come. I was getting my mail when she marched up my driveway like she owned it. She didn't introduce herself or anything, just started talking like we were in the middle of a conversation. "Your mailbox is crooked," she announced, pointing at my perfectly normal mailbox. "It's destroying the aesthetic of the street." I remember just standing there, bills in hand, thinking, I must have misheard her. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your mailbox," she repeated, speaking slower, like I was somehow the confused one. "It's 3 degrees off-center. I measured it this morning." Who measures their neighbor's mailbox? Linda, apparently. "I'm Rob," I said, trying to be friendly despite her weird opening. "You must be the new neighbor?" She ignored my attempt at politeness. "We'll need to fix that mailbox situation immediately. I'm thinking of organizing a neighborhood committee to standardize all the mailboxes. I've already drawn up some designs." That was my first red flag. Actually, it was more like a red banner being waved by a marching band, but I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just nervous about being new to the neighborhood. Spoiler alert, I was very, very wrong. The real trouble started about a week later with my fence. I have this 6-foot privacy fence that separates my backyard from hers. It's nothing fancy, just your standard wooden privacy fence that's been there for at least a decade. I was out mowing my lawn one Saturday morning when I spotted something weird. Linda was standing on what looked like a stepladder, peering over my fence like some kind of nosy giraffe. When she spotted me, she didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. Instead, she climbed down and click-clacked her way around to my driveway in her ridiculous designer heels. The grass was wet from morning dew, but somehow she managed to strut across my lawn like it was a catwalk. "We need to talk about this monstrosity," she declared, waving her manicured hand at my fence. I cut the mower's engine. "Good morning to you too, Linda." "Do you have any idea what this fence does to property values?" she demanded, completely ignoring my sarcasm. "Increases them," I suggested. "You know, because of privacy." She let out this dramatic sigh that I would come to know very well. "It's hostile architecture. It sends the wrong message about our community. I'm thinking we should replace it with a nice white picket fence, maybe 3 feet high. I've already contacted some contractors." I held up my hand. "Hold up. We? There is no we here, Linda. This is my fence. On my property." "Well," she said, pulling out her phone, "according to the property guidelines—" "There are no property guidelines," I interrupted. "We don't have an HOA." You would have thought I'd just told her Christmas was canceled. Her perfectly Botoxed face somehow managed to show shock. "No HOA? That's unacceptable. How do we maintain standards?" "We don't," I said. "Everyone just takes care of their own property however they want to." "Well, that simply won't do," she declared. "I'll have to start one immediately. I have experience running these things, you know. In my last neighborhood, I was president of the— Linda, I cut her off again. You can't just start an HOA. It requires majority agreement from homeowners, legal documentation, and— Oh, don't worry about all that, she waved dismissively. I have connections. Now, about this fence. The fence stays, I said firmly. End of discussion. She gave me this look like I was a disobedient child. We'll see about that. And boy, did we ever see about that. Over the next few weeks, Linda launched what I can only describe as a psychological warfare campaign against my fence. She called the city multiple times to report it as a hazardous structure. She tried to convince other neighbors it was decreasing their property values. She even put up these huge mirrors in her yard to reflect the negative energy back at my fence. I'm not making this up, she actually said that. But the fence drama was just the beginning. Linda had apparently decided that if she couldn't control my fence, she'd control everything else about my property. One day, I came home from work early because I had a headache. As I pulled into my driveway, I literally had to rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. There was Linda, dressed in what looked like designer gardening clothes, who even owns those, methodically spraying something on my lawn. I jumped out of my car so fast I forgot to take off my seatbelt and nearly clotheslined myself. Linda, what are you doing? She turned around with this serene smile, like she was doing me some huge favor. Oh, hello, Rob. I'm just taking care of these awful weeds. Did you know you have 17 different types of invasive species in your yard? I cataloged them all yesterday. You cataloged my weeds? I stood there trying to process this information. Wait, when were you in my yard yesterday? Oh, I come by every morning while you're at work, she said casually, like this was completely normal behavior. Someone has to maintain standards around here. I felt my blood pressure rising. Linda, that's trespassing. And what are you even spraying? It's an organic weed killer I get specially imported from Switzerland, she answered, actually sounding proud. It's $200 a bottle, but you can't put a price on perfection. I walked over and grabbed the sprayer from her hands. You're killing my grass. Well, if you actually took care of your lawn properly, I wouldn't have to intervene, she huffed. Do you know what your dandelions are doing to my property values? I've already had to adjust my home insurance because of the potential contamination. That's not how any of this works, I said, pinching the bridge of my nose. Linda, this is my property. You can't just come here and spray chemicals whenever you want. She pulled out her phone and started showing me pictures. Look at these before and after photos I took. Your yard is clearly bringing down the whole neighborhood's aesthetic. I've started a PowerPoint presentation for the community meeting. What community meeting? The one I'm organizing next week. I've already invited everyone on the street. We're going to vote on standardized lawn care procedures. I took a deep breath. Linda, you can't enforce lawn care rules without an HOA, which we still don't have. Actually, she said with this smug smile, I've been researching local ordinances, and there's a clause from 1987 that— I'm calling the police, I interrupted, pulling out my phone. Her eyes widened slightly. Don't be dramatic. I'm helping you. You're trespassing and destroying my property, I corrected her. When the police arrived, Linda tried to convince them she was part of an official neighborhood beautification committee. The officers just stared at her while she pulled up her PowerPoint presentation on her phone, attempting to explain why her actions were justified. They gave her a warning for trespassing, and I thought that would be the end of it, but oh, was I wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find my entire front yard had been sprayed with something that turned the grass neon green. I'm not exaggerating, it looked like a radioactive waste spill. Security cameras went up that afternoon, all of them pointed at my yard, which apparently offended Linda even more. Those cameras are invasive, she yelled from her driveway. They're clearly aimed at my house. They're aimed at my yard, I shouted back, to catch anyone who might be trespassing or vandalizing my property. Are you implying something? She demanded. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it directly. Stay off my property. That's when the parking war began. I didn't even know you could have a parking war, but leave it to Linda to invent one. She started by putting up these professional-looking no parking signs all along my curb. Not her curb. My curb. I came home one evening to find my friend's car had been ticketed, not by the police, by Linda. She had printed out official-looking violations and was sticking them on any car that parked in front of my house. When I confronted her about it, she had the audacity to pull out a 3-ring binder full of neighborhood regulations she had written herself. Section 7, paragraph 3 clearly states that all parking must be approved by the neighborhood council, she said, pointing to a page. Linda, you can't just make up rules and put them in a binder. I didn't make them up, she insisted. I adapted them from my previous neighborhood's guidelines. I have them copyrighted. The boulders, now that was my masterpiece. After watching Linda repeatedly drive across my lawn through my security cameras, I knew I had to do something dramatic. I'm talking about full-on tire tracks in my grass, day after day, like my yard was her personal shortcut. I called my buddy Mike, who owns a landscaping business. Hey, how much would it cost to get some really big, decorative boulders? Depends, he said. Are we talking garden feature or territorial warfare? The second one. He laughed. Let me guess, that new neighbor of yours? Word about Linda had spread pretty far by this point. She'd managed to terrorize half the neighborhood in just a few months. Mrs. Johnson, 2 doors down, caught her measuring her windows for regulation curtains. The Patels found her reorganizing their recycling bins because they weren't sorted by material density. The boulders arrived at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. I specifically chose this time because Linda always did her morning power walk at 6:30, and I wanted her to see this. We positioned these massive rocks, each one about waist-high, strategically along the edge of my property. They looked great, actually. Very natural. Right on schedule, Linda power walked past my house, designer workout gear practically glowing in the morning light. She stopped dead in her tracks. "What is the meaning of this?" she screeched, pulling out her AirPods. I was casually watering my flowers. "Oh, good morning, Linda. Just doing some landscaping." "These rocks," she sputtered. "They're not approved." "Approved by whom?" I asked innocently. "The HOA that doesn't exist? The neighborhood council you made up? The garden committee that's just you with a clipboard?" Her face turned this interesting shade of purple. "This is clearly targeted harassment." "Actually," I said, pulling out my own binder, 2 can play that game, "I have documentation of exactly why these boulders are necessary." I showed her printed screenshots from my security cameras of her car driving across my lawn. "Those cameras are an invasion of privacy," she shouted. "They recording my property which you keep trespassing on." She stormed off, but I knew this wasn't over. Later that day, I actually caught her trying to measure the boulders with a tape measure, probably looking for some obscure regulation they violated. The next morning was when it all came to a head. I was enjoying my coffee, watching through my window like it was Netflix. Right on cue, Linda backed out of her driveway, taking her usual route across my lawn. Crunch. The sound was magnificent. The look on her face was even better. Her bumper was now intimately acquainted with one of my larger boulders, and let me tell you, the boulder won. Linda exploded out of her car like a champagne cork. "You did this on purpose!" I walked outside, still in my robe, coffee in hand. "Did what? Put decorative landscaping on my own property? Why, yes. Yes, I did." "Do you know how much this car costs?" "Probably about as much as all the damage you've done to my property," I replied calmly, taking a sip of coffee. That's when she lost it completely. She started ranting about lawsuits and property values and her cousin the lawyer. Then she pulled out her phone and called the police. When they arrived, Linda was in full meltdown mode. "Officers, this man has deliberately sabotaged my vehicle. He's been harassing me for months. He put up cameras to spy on me. He's destroying our community standards." The younger officer looked confused. "Ma'am, please calm down. What exactly happened?" "He put these rocks in my way." "In your driveway?" the officer asked. "No, right here." She pointed at the boulder, which was very clearly on my property. "Ma'am, that appears to be decorative landscaping on private property," the older officer said. "But I always drive through here." The officers exchanged looks. One of them turned to me. "Sir, do you have any documentation of these incidents?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I pulled out my phone and showed them everything. Videos of Linda trespassing, spraying my lawn, putting up illegal signs, the works. I even had screenshots of her social media posts where she bragged about taking control of the neighborhood. The older officer's face went from professional to done with this in about 10 seconds. Ma'am, based on this evidence, you've committed multiple counts of trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of private property. Linda's face went through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. But he's the one who... Please turn around and put your hands behind your back. What followed was perhaps the most satisfying 5 minutes of my life. Linda, still in her designer workout gear, being handcuffed and read her rights while the whole neighborhood watched. Someone was even recording it on their phone, probably for the neighborhood Facebook group she kept trying to take over. As they put her in the police car, she was still yelling about property values and community standards. I just stood there, sipping my coffee, watching karma do its thing. The aftermath? Linda was charged with multiple offenses, had to pay for all the damage she'd done to my property, and ended up moving away 3 months later. I heard she tried to start drama in her new neighborhood too, but apparently they already had an HOA, a real one, and they weren't too fond of her improvements. My yard is peaceful now. The boulders are still there, covered in flowering vines, serving as a monument to the time a Karen named Linda learned that no amount of designer sunglasses and self-important attitude can put you above the law. And the fence? It's still standing, 6 feet tall and beautiful as ever. Sometimes I sit in my backyard, enjoying the privacy it provides, and think about Linda. I hope she's out there somewhere, measuring someone else's mailbox, dreaming of property values and regulation curtains. But not in my neighborhood, never again in my neighborhood. If you enjoyed this tale of entitled neighbors getting exactly what they deserve, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the Entitled Files. Hit that notification bell to catch our next story of karmic justice, and let me know in the comments about your own experiences with neighborhood Karens. See you in the next one.